One of the reasons we respect the people that we respect the most is their response to this, to adversity, right? Like the people that we respect the most are generally people who've walked through a fire or two, figuratively or literally. We respect people who've been hurt but didn't hurt back, who were treated unjustly but didn't strike back. We respect people who have faced extraordinary health challenges but didn't lose their love for life. They didn't despair. Instead, they used their superpower. That's right, their superpower. A power, by the way, that we all have. And when used, it actually keeps us from becoming like that and those we don't respect. It keeps us from just reflecting or echoing our circumstances or the culture. Our superpower overcomes evil and allows us to redeem suffering. And it's your superpower that enables you to live forward. Now, I chose to start 2020 with this conversation because, well, while we're all ready for things to get back to normal, or maybe even a new normal, we would all agree that all of this pain without any gain would definitely be a shame. So we're pausing to ask the question, what have we learned? And what have we observed that we want to carry forward? Or to the point of this series, how can we be better for it? What have we been doing that almost led to our undoing? Or what were we doing that almost led to our undoing? Or what should we have been doing all along? Because again, it would be tragic to forget the lessons that we've learned, and it would certainly be tragic to lose the perspective we've gained. So last week, I said that we all have a superpower. You have a special ability that empowers us to be better for anything that life throws at you, or actually anything that life has thrown at you. And our superpower is our respondability. It's our respondability, our ability to respond rather than react. Because your ability to choose a response rather than having one dictated to you, or your ability to choose rather than just do what's expected or simply model what you've seen done, your ability to respond allows you to dictate and to influence your own future. Think about this, because you know this. In fact, we've all seen this. To simply react to our circumstances sets us up to reflect those circumstances. And this is the point of today's message. When we just simply react, we actually give up control of our lives. And we ultimately give up control of our destiny and even our legacy. But a measured response, a measured, thought-through response ensures that doesn't happen. But as I said last time, there's a catch. There's a reason we miss this. And that's the reason we're talking about it. And here's the catch. The response that has the potential to reverse the natural course of things isn't natural. Let me say it this way. The response that makes the most difference, that moves us in a positive direction, in a forward direction, is the response we are least likely to choose, and most often are tempted or tend to miss. So to illustrate this and to drag us deep into the context of this and to the emotion of this, last week we began a story, an epic story that many of us are familiar with. It's an Old Testament story, the story of Joseph, a young man who used his superpower, get this, for about 25 years before the story ultimately is resolved. And his story, I believe, better than any other story I've ever heard, his story illustrates the sustaining, sanity-preserving, course-reversing power of a measured response. And like me, like you, Joseph didn't know the end of his story. In fact, Joseph didn't even know where the story was worth telling. But throughout his story and throughout his circumstances, he chose the unusual response, the unexpected response. So you're probably familiar with the story, but let me catch you up to where we left off last time. He's basically Joseph's life this far. Joseph's been kidnapped once by his brothers. He's been sold twice, first to slave traders, and then he's sold again in Egypt. Then he's framed for a crime he didn't commit. And the reason he was punished is because he wouldn't commit the crime. And then ultimately, he's in prison. So this is his resume. And again, to catch you up, nobody's looking for Joseph. Nobody's looking out for Joseph. And whatever your life has been, wherever you're watching from today, perhaps that's where your story intersects with Joseph. And yet, in spite of all these unbelievable circumstances, any one of those things, right, would be enough. But in spite of all that, Joseph continued to respond as if God was with him. And that brings me to the question that we left off with last time, the question we're going to end with this time as well. How would someone in your circumstances respond if they were absolutely confident that God was with them? How would someone in your circumstances respond? You know how people in your circumstances normally react. We all know what's expected of people in our circumstances. You know what's been modeled for you. But how would someone in your circumstances respond if they were absolutely confident that God was with them? That there was more to the story that meets the eye. That your current circumstances are simply a chapter, not the entire story. So back to Joseph. Following the accusation, Joseph's master Potiphar imprisons him, and we pick up the story there. Joseph's master took Joseph and he put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was in prison, and here it is again, while Joseph was in prison, the Lord was with him. Do you see it? While he was being punished for something he didn't do because he wouldn't do it. And this is the craziest part of the story to me. While he was being punished for something he didn't do because he wouldn't do it, the Lord was with him. While he's suffering, while he's being treated unjustly, while he's being treated unfairly, while he's sheltering in place, God is with Joseph. See, these are the moments when we want to say, God, where are you? Where have you gone? And God says, I'm right there with you. This is us. We say, but it doesn't feel like you're right here with me. It doesn't seem like you're here with me right now. Where are you? To which God would say, I'm right there with you. Okay? So, while Joseph was in prison, the Lord was with him, and God showed him, the word is kindness. Now, the word translated kindness in our English text, in the Hebrew text, is actually meaning loving kindness, okay? It's a covenant word. In fact, throughout most of our English Old Testament, it's translated loving kindness. And the implication is this: Joseph considered himself in a sort of covenant relationship with God, with a God who hadn't done anything for him lately. In fact, let's look at what this loving kindness looked like. The author continues and he tells us what loving kindness looks like here. The text says, he showed him kindness and he granted him favor. Now, if it had only stopped there, but it goes on. He granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden, which, if we're honest, is a problem for us. Because in our way of thinking, if we're honest, we think if God is with you, if God is for you, you do not have a relationship with a prison warden, right? In fact, if God is with you and if God is for you, you are not in prison. And you are certainly not in prison for something that you didn't do, for something you've been accused of but didn't do. I'm sure there must have been moments. As I read this, as I think about this, there had to have been moments, and I'm just making this up, but I'm sure there are moments where Joseph must have thought, I wish God would just go be with someone else for a change, right? Like, God, go be with my brothers for a change. Or go be with Potiphar's wife. Like, I need a break from all this with. Well, months go by, years go by, no weekends off. And this doesn't even really feel like a story. It doesn't feel like it's going anywhere. And Joseph certainly isn't going anywhere. He's in prison. And then, seemingly unrelated, Pharaoh's baker and butler have a falling out with Pharaoh. And Pharaoh is so angry with them that he puts them in prison. And he puts them in the same prison where Joseph is, okay? And then the story has a strange twist. The captain of the guard, who is assigned to running the prison, assigned the butler and the baker to Joseph. And Joseph attended them, and they had been there for some time. Because a lot of time goes by in the story. The butler and the baker, Pharaoh's butler and baker, they have disturbing dreams on the same night. And Joseph noticed that they're disturbed by something. And I think this is kind of funny. Here they are in a dungeon. And so Joseph is serving them breakfast one morning, and he actually says, hey guys, why do you look so sad today? To which they could have responded, well, to begin with, there's the fact that we're here in this dungeon. But that's not in the text. So Joseph says to them, why are you so sad today? And both of them share that they had very disturbing dreams, vivid dreams. Like they can remember all the details. And they're both convinced that the dreams mean something. But they have no idea how to interpret their dreams. And then Joseph responds with this. Do not interpretations belong to God? See, Joseph is still believing. He's still trusting, even in the midst of these crazy circumstances. He's continuing to respond rather than react. Then he says to the butler and the baker, tell me your dreams. So the butler, the wine taster, he goes first. And so he tells Joseph this elaborate dream, and Joseph smiles and he says, I've got some good news for you. 3 days from now, in 3 days, Pharaoh is going to lift up your head and restore you to your position. And of course, the butler doesn't know if Joseph is just making this up, but this is certainly a positive outcome to his dream. And don't miss this, at this point in the story, we discover something about Joseph that's true of all of us. I want you to watch this. As much as Joseph had a sense, even perhaps confidence, that God was with him, he was not enjoying the circumstances he was in. He despised his circumstances. He was not immune to the pain and the suffering. And he says to the butler, look, when your dream comes true, when you're finally out of here, when all goes well with you, remember me. Remember this conversation and show me kindness. Perhaps a different kind of kindness that my God has been showing me lately. But mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews. He says, I was kidnapped. And even here, I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. So, even though God was with Joseph, Joseph felt what we would have felt. He was frustrated. He was as frustrated as we would be. And he says to the butler, look, you are my only way out of this. Remember me when this dream comes true. Well, the baker is sitting there hearing all of this, and he's thinking, hey, my turn, my turn. So Joseph says, okay, tell me about your dream. And the baker explains this very detailed dream. And when he's finished, Joseph shakes his head and he says, man, that's a tough one. I'm afraid I can't help you. Actually, that's not what he said, but it's probably what the baker wished he would have said. But he looks at the baker and he says this. Here's what he says the dream means. Within 3 days, Pharaoh isn't going to lift up your head, he's going to lift off your head. And he's going to impale your body on a pole. TMI, right? Well, apparently Joseph was not in a good mood that morning, and he could have just stopped right there, but he didn't. He continued. He said, "Oh yeah, there's one more little part to your dream. And the birds will eat away your flesh. Have a nice day. Anybody else here need a dream interpreted?" But sure enough, 3 days later, it's Pharaoh's birthday, and just like Joseph predicted, he restored the cupbearer and he beheaded and impaled the baker. And now, think about it. Joseph expectantly waits. He's ready for a change because he knows what's going to happen. As soon as these dreams come true, just as he predicted, he knows the butler is going to go to Pharaoh and say, "Pharaoh, you're not going to believe this, but while I was in your dungeon," sorry to bring that up, "but while I was in your dungeon, I met a Hebrew boy who said this would happen." So every time somebody bangs on the door of the dungeon, Joseph thinks, "This is my day. I'm out of here." Every time there's a guest, every time there's a visitor, every time the warden calls his name, he thinks, "This is the day. I'm out of here." But the text tells us the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, and he forgot him. Wow. So yeah, this is the young man, now an older man, that God was supposedly with. So a couple years go by. He's 30 years old. And then suddenly, again, unrelated to anything happening for Joseph, Pharaoh has a series of disturbing dreams. Guess what? You know the story. Nobody can interpret the dreams. Finally, the butler remembers Joseph. And he says to Pharaoh, "Hey, Pharaoh, remember a couple years ago we had that falling out? Hate to mention it. You put me in the dungeon. Remember that? Which I'm sure I deserved. But while I was there was a young Hebrew man, and he interpreted my dream correctly." And the text says this, tells us, immediately Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. And after he had been shaved and been given clean clothes, he came before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I had a dream, and no one can interpret it, but I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." What comes next are perhaps the most courageous words ever spoken by anyone in history. Here's this foreigner for whom God had done nothing lately. This is his big break. He hasn't smelled this good or looked this good for years. And Joseph looks at the most powerful man in the world, his way out, and he says, "I cannot do it. I cannot do it." And I believe the butler had to be over in the corner thinking, "Oh no, I'm going back to the dungeon." But Joseph said to Pharaoh, he probably should have stopped right there, but he said, "I cannot do it, but he said, but God. And the problem with this is that Pharaoh thought he was a god, and Pharaoh believed in other gods. And clearly the gods of the Egyptians were more powerful than the Hebrew gods. And now here's this foreigner who has this one opportunity for freedom, and he says, "Pharaoh, I can't do it, but my God can. My God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." Wow. I think everybody in the royal courtroom at that moment thought this is likely the end for this young Hebrew. But fortunately for Joseph, Pharaoh was more curious than he was offended. And so he explains his two dreams to Joseph, and Joseph listens patiently. And then it's quiet. And he looks at Pharaoh and he says, "Pharaoh, here's what your dreams mean. For the next 7 years, there's going to be an abundant grain harvest in Egypt. There's going to be so much grain, you aren't even going to know what to do with it all. But after those 7 years will be followed by a famine, and nothing's going to grow. In fact, the abundance will not even be remembered." Imagine that. Let me put it this way. The 7 years of plenty will not even be remembered because of the famine that follows. It's going to be so severe. He's silent. No one says anything. And then Joseph does the unthinkable. Imagine this. He leans in and begins to tell Pharaoh what to do. He begins to advise Pharaoh, and he says, Pharaoh, here's what you need to do. You need to appoint somebody and put them in charge of this problem. There needs to be somebody who wakes up every single day focused on solving this problem and is preparing Egypt during the 7 years of plenty for the 7 years of famine. Well, the plan seemed good to Pharaoh, and it seemed good to all his officials. So, Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone? Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? And then, this is so amazing. And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God, your Hebrew God, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You, Joseph, shall be in charge of my palace. He makes Joseph the prime minister of Egypt. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. Wow. So, Joseph goes to work. He begins preparing Egypt for the 7 years of famine. In fact, the text said that Joseph began to store up such huge quantities of grain. It was like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. In fact, what he did was brilliant. He built storehouses in all the major cities and purchased the grain from the people. And as there was more and more and more and more grain, the price kept dropping and dropping and dropping. So he stored up all this grain. 7 years after the time of plenty, the rain stops. Nothing will grow. The people of Egypt begin to starve. And then Joseph opened these storehouses in these primary cities, and he began to sell grain in Pharaoh's name to the people. Well, all as it is with all famines, it spreads to the surrounding regions, even up north of Egypt where Joseph's family lives, Jacob and his sons, Joseph's brothers. And they began to starve as well. And this is where the story takes an interesting twist. Here's what happens next. When Jacob, Joseph's father, learned there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, why do you just keep looking at each other? Do something. Any of you ever heard anything like that from your dad? Do something. Like he says, I've heard there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die. Again, if you've heard this story, you know what happens next. But I mean, there is so much drama because now the stage is set. Fortunes have been reversed. Joseph is now 40 years old. His brothers have not seen him since he was 17 years old. And this will be the ultimate test of Joseph's superpower. This will be the ultimate test of his willingness to respond rather than react. And everybody that knew or knows his story knows exactly how he's expected to react. And if we put ourselves in his position, we know exactly how we would react. So the story continues. Now, Joseph, by this time, is governor of the land. He's the second most powerful person in Egypt, which means, for all practical purposes, Joseph, is the second most powerful person in the world. It says he was the governor of the land and the person who sold the grain to all his people. So, when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. And as soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but pretended to be a stranger. Okay? Imagine this moment. He remembers the terror. Joseph remembers the terror of having his clothes stripped from him and being thrown into that empty well. He remembers the dampness of the pit and the fear, wondering, are they going to leave me? Are they going to abandon me here? He remembers the slave traders and the humiliation of being sold at auction. He remembers the hopelessness of prison and remembers the despair of being forgotten by the butler. And then he does the most remarkable thing. For a while, as he's trying to make up his mind, Joseph kind of messes with his brother. He actually finds out from them that their father is still alive and finds out that they have a brother that's not with them, Benjamin. And so he sends them back, but he keeps one of them as a hostage. It just goes on and on and on, chapter after chapter, and he's trying to decide what he's going to do. He tries to decide, have they really changed? Are they still the brothers they used to be? And finally, after all this long back and forth, that's really so fascinating. There's so much detail in the text. He finally, at the end, defies expectation. Joseph defies certainly his own nature, his own instinct, his own emotion, and he employs superpower one more time. They're gathered with him. By this time, they've brought Benjamin. So it's all 11 brothers. He sends everyone else out of the room. They're on their knees, and suddenly they're all alone with the prime minister of Egypt, and they're confused. And he stares at each one of them and announces, imagine this, he announces, I am Joseph. I am Joseph. And they look up and they see that 17-year-old boy in the face of that 40-year-old man, and they realize, but before they can say anything, Joseph says, is my father still living? The text says, but his brothers, of course, his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. But they didn't need to be terrified in his presence because in their absence, Joseph had lived every single day of his life as if God was present. And now, when it counted the most, Joseph once again chose not to react, but to respond. And he forgave his brothers. The text says this, come close to me, he said. And I bet that took a while, don't you think? Come close to me, he said. I'm your brother, Joseph. And I guess he just can't help himself. The one you remember, the one you sold into Egypt. But now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. Now, I need to press pause and just say something about that real quick. Listen. When we are able to believe and when we were able to respond as if God is with us, listen, we gain a perspective on what's behind our circumstances that we can't gain any other way. And this is such a powerful reminder of that, because Joseph is able to come to the conclusion, the reason I'm here, the reason I'm in these circumstances, the reason I went through everything I went through, is because God has had a plan in my suffering. And God has had a plan in the injustice. And God has had a plan in the circumstances that I would not have chosen for myself. But God had a plan for me to be forgotten. And God had a plan for me to be sold. Not once, but twice. See, when we choose to respond, when we are responsible with our respondability, looking back, we have a perspective on our suffering that we cannot gain any other way. Listen to me. But if all we do is react, not only will we not be better for it, not be better for our suffering, we will never have the perspective that allows us to successfully move into our future. Man, this is good preaching. Listen, here's what nobody knew about this encounter, that God's entire plan of salvation for the world hung by the thread of Joseph's response. Not his reaction, but his response. See, before him is the nation of Israel. The 12 brothers represented the 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 tribes that would become the nation of Israel, that ultimately, through which would come the Messiah. The Messiah who would do for the world exactly what Joseph did that day for his brothers. Do you see it? And this is why I said last time, and this is why I hope you'll never forget. Never, never, ever, never, never, ever underestimate the power of a measured response. Well, the story wraps up this way. Joseph brings his entire family to Egypt, and he provides for them for years and years and years. Eventually, his father Jacob dies, and once they bury Jacob, and they have this elaborate funeral, and they all come back to the land of Egypt, his brothers get together. The 10 brothers that sold him into slavery get together, and they realize, perhaps Joseph was just waiting for our father to die before he exacts his revenge. And so they go to Joseph, and the text says this. His brothers came to him and threw themselves down before him, and they said to him, "We are your slaves." But Joseph continues to respond rather than react. And here's what he said. These famous words you've probably heard, probably even used. Joseph says, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God?" And I just think we need to hear this. To say, guys, don't you understand that God was in this? That God worked through this? Am I in the place of God? In the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, it's written this way: "Do not be afraid, for I am God's." Do not be afraid, I belong to God. And since I belong to God, who am I to act like or step into the place of God? You intended, he said, you intended to harm me. That day when you kidnapped me, that day when you stripped me, that day when you threw me into that empty well, you had the power. The odds were in your favor. There was evil in your heart. You created circumstances that generally transform the offended into the offenders, but not this time. You intended to harm me. But God intended it for good. To accomplish, he said, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Wow. Don't ever, ever, ever forget this. God's intention. This is amazing. God's intention became a reality through one man's unprecedented, circumstance-defined responses. Responses, listen, none of which seemed significant at the time. Drop into this story and take just any one of his responses. None of his individual responses seemed that significant, but altogether, they were part of the unfolding story of my redemption and yours. God's plan of salvation for the world. So, here's the thing. Our superpower, our respondability gives us the potential to live forward, to be better for it, whatever it is. And you know this. That's part of the problem, right? We don't get to choose the it, but our response, your response, is what determines whether or not we will be better for it, regardless of what the it is. And it all comes down to this one terrifying, liberating, life-changing, destiny-altering question. How would someone in my circumstances respond? How would someone in my circumstances respond? How would someone in my circumstances respond? We all know how someone in my circumstances would react. We see that all the time. But how would someone in my circumstances, in your circumstances, respond if they were absolutely confident God was with them? Your answer to this question is your invitation to use your superpower. Your answer to this question is your best way forward. And if you act on it, you will emerge from whatever you're facing better for it. Let's face it, we are no better than our responses, but our responses have the extraordinary potential to make us and the world better. So one more time, you have a superpower, your respondability. Use it, because if you do, you'll be better for it. The people around you will be better for it, and who knows, perhaps the world will be better for it as well.